All right, guys, welcome back. We're here. It's episode 6. We have made it through Around the Table, and it's been an incredible series, one that I know we've all really enjoyed being a part of, seeing the fruit of, and just walking through these texts has been awesome.
Yep. I love it.
I know you do.
I love reading scripture and finding a different way to dive into the Easter story, and this is a different way.
Yeah, for sure. But I think the threads have been so constant through that of we see the meals, we see what happens, we see the life that happens, we see Jesus so intentional in these last days of his earthly ministry and what he's doing, what he needs to do. And I think as we'll get into a little bit today, just so very intentional and ordained what happens here in these moments. So this week we are in Luke 22 and we are at the Last Supper.
Yep.
Pretty iconic meal if we're going to talk meals.
It is. I think we need to recognize that it's Palm Sunday, so it's kind of odd on Palm Sunday to not be talking about the triumphal entry. So there wasn't a meal at the triumphal entry, so it's hard. But we recognize Palm Sunday.
We do.
And that's right.
The
crowds are excited and Jesus is here.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. Yep. So, but let's set the scene a little bit because we are kind of starting here at the betrayal, Judas agreeing to that set in motion these events of the last few days of Christ.
Yeah, Luke at the beginning of chapter 22, he sets the stage for you to let you know what's going on outside the doors. Well, what's going on in the community of Jerusalem. Meanwhile, preparing for this meal. Sermon's not written. I have to tell you that all the time. The sermons aren't written until I get off stage on Sunday. But I think it's important to recognize as we've gone through all of these different settings, and I hope I say this on Sunday, is we've looked at some really important meals. This has to be the most important meal in history. And there have been some important meals, right? Like you think of politicians gathering to find a peace treaty or to, World War I, World War II, go through all the different times when people have had meals. This one meal is something that has shaped 50% of our world for 2,000 years. That's huge.
Yeah.
And once a month in some denominations, every week in some denominations, maybe not as frequent, people remember the broken body, the shed blood. This meal is crucial, what we're going to talk about. And I think the juxtaposition is it's maybe the most important meal, but there was only one person at the table that knew what was going on. If we're going to be fair.
Yeah.
We can give the disciples a lot of credit.
Mm-hmm.
There's no way they knew what was happening.
No, not at all.
So to get back to your context, we get the picture, the Sanhedrin or the scribes and the chief priests decided he's got to go.
They made up their mind that this is enough.
The only way to deal with this guy is to kill him.
Yeah.
They're afraid of the crowds. I think there's some conversation we could have there about why the crowds. Why aren't they afraid of God? So they're justifying murder because the crowds are starting to rise up. So they've got to cut the head off the snake. That's probably not the best way to say that, but they're going to deal with Jesus. And they're trying to figure out how to do it. Well, they find an advocate in Judas. And Luke tells us that he decides to go and conspire with them to betray Jesus. There's so much dialogue about Judas. What was it? Was he trying to help Jesus? There's people that try to side on Judas' side and say, was he trying to move things along?
Yeah, I've saw that thread in some studies.
That's people. I think we're trying to make something out of nothing there. Apparently, it seems to me like Judas was done, and maybe this Jesus wasn't who he thought he was going to be. And Luke tells you that Satan entered him. That's an interesting way to put that. And there will be people that will watch this podcast and on Sunday morning, they think Satan entered him, and maybe he did. I think how we handle that scripture is important because possession in those areas, that's a whole line of theology that we probably need to spend a whole lot more time talking about. I think the best way to understand this is he decided this moment that what he was going to do was the most against God thing. Mm-hmm. He was going to go counter to everything that Jesus was doing. So in this moment, he made that decision that what he was going to do was going to be evil.
Yeah. An intentional decision that he made, and that gave them the tool they needed, the key to be able to do this.
They got someone on the inside
outside of a potential uprising from the people, because I think that's a thread constant in Luke, is that Jesus was popular with people. They loved being around Jesus.
And they needed a way to get to him when no one else would be around. They tried to approach him many times in Scripture before, and he either confounded them or sent them away, or they knew they couldn't get him.
Yeah.
And now they got someone on the inside. So we in the worship planning the other day, there was the thought came up. I wonder what it felt like to be Judas. So we have the thought: what does it feel like to be Jesus, to know that in less than 24 hours you're going to be dead? What does it feel like to be Judas, to know you're sitting at this table, you've just followed this guy for 3 years, and everybody else is around with you, and you know you've just been paid, or you've been set up an arrangement to betray this guy? Imagine sitting at the table with that bit of information.
And it's not in Luke, is it, that the washing of the feet?
Nope, that's John. John gives us the rest of it.
And so you know that too, that Jesus is washing Judas's feet.
Yeah.
Both of them knowing what is happening.
Yeah. All of the Gospels tell us, and at one point, maybe a little bit before, right here, Luke tells us right at the end of the section we're going to read, that they start arguing over who's the best. And so I think if you understand how the Gospels were written, John was the last Gospel written, and I often wonder if John wasn't trying to flesh that scene out, because none of the Gospels they give you information about that night, but they don't give you the true picture. John spends multiple chapters talking about what happened, starting off with him washing their feet. Mm-hmm. So he gives you the ministry aspect of how Jesus dealt with them fighting over who was the best. So when we read in Luke, if you only had Luke, you missed that other part of the picture. But since we have the 4 Gospels and we can compare it, Jesus saw them jockeying for position, and then gets up from the table, he wraps a towel around his waist, and he starts washing their feet. Who else does that?
Only Jesus.
Only Jesus.
And to go back to what you said, it just made me think too, this is Jesus' last time on earth, and this is what he wants to do.
Yeah.
He absolutely needs to do this.
The eagerly desire.
Yeah.
Right? There's so many other times where he says, it's not my time. It's not my time. It's not my time. Over and over again. And then you can imagine if you're around him, you're like, well, when is the time? And then he gets up at the table and he says, I've eagerly desired to do this. Kristen, in our worship planning, that was the very first thing that she said. It seems like God is so much in the details. There is, like, if you did a true study of everything that happens in these 7 days, but even in this last 24 hours, the amount of prophecy, the amount of things that happen, no one could orchestrate this. There's not a way on the planet that you could orchestrate Jesus celebrating this meal with them, calling his shot, broken body, shed blood. He's arrested later in the garden. He goes through, was it 3 trials? Mm-hmm. And then he's crucified, and he dies on Calvary at the exact time that they're slaughtering all the lambs in Jerusalem for the Passover. You can't make it up. Nobody could have figured out how to do that. He just did. It's just what he did.
Yep.
So it brings in this notion of timing, and this may be a deviation. Some of you guys will like this podcast, some of you won't. But to get into the details, you have to have this weird thought of if he dies on Calvary while all the lambs are being slaughtered, how are they celebrating Passover and eating a lamb?
Right.
Because that lamb had to be slaughtered, but they're a day early, so they're off schedule. If you go back and you look in history, there were so many people that came into Jerusalem, possibly 2.5 million in antiquity. The city would have been choked out. So the priests created a schedule that allowed them to do all of these sacrifices in such a short window. What they did is they set a schedule for those from the region of the Galilee and those who were in Judea, which is Jerusalem and that area around, where on Thursday or this night is when they would have slaughtered all the lambs from those who came from Galilee. So Jesus is in time having Passover with the people that he's with, but he's actually becomes the Passover lamb and dies on Calvary in what would have been the normal Jewish calendar that he would have probably held to be true.
Right.
So he's able to do both, and it happens in history in a way that you can't refute it. It's perfect. Because he could have been in 2 places at one time, but it unfolds exactly as prophecy said and exactly as it lays out. It's so interesting.
Incredible.
Yeah.
Incredible. Only Jesus. Only Jesus.
Yeah.
Even the details of when they go to prepare, you're going to find this guy with a pitcher of water, which I know Jim Bell mentioned. That was unheard of in that culture. You wouldn't have found
guys
a guy
didn't carry water.
Carrying water.
Yeah.
So already you can really go down the line of just seeing just thing after thing of, wow, it blows your mind.
In my Bible study this morning, there was some talk about that because it almost seems clandestine. We're just up a room. Who's this guy? What's this stuff? And I think in my mind, I get nervous about the mystic. I think, Jesus didn't appear to somebody and tell him to prepare this room, and all of a sudden someone's going to show up. I think it makes more sense to imagine that in Jesus' ministry, he's saving, he's not saving, he's healing, he's blessing, he's taking care of people. So he would have had connections, because in a city that's just full of people, there would not have been an open room available for the Passover, except that Jesus made these arrangements and he had connections. He just needed the disciples to go prepare for it. And the other Gospels don't tell us who those disciples are. This one does, but it's Peter and John, which is so key, because as you go through the rest of the conversation, John tells us that they have a conversation at the table. There's more to it. So those two, for some reason, are the ones that Jesus uses in these most crucial moments to get the job done. They would have had to get the food together. They would have had to get that lamb to be slaughtered. They would have had to prepare the lamb, which means it would have been roasted. If you go back in Exodus and you read it, it's roasted whole with all of the innards. And then whatever they don't eat, they've got to burn and get rid of the rest. So like there's all this preparation that has to go into it. All of that had to happen for him to sit down and do what we do in 15 minutes on Sunday.
Yeah.
This is my body broken for you. This is my blood shed for you. This meal is significant.
And I would really encourage everyone to come out to Maundy Thursday too, because you see this meal, the representation of it, the prayers, the blessings, what would have happened in a whole new and much, much deeper way. It's really, really incredible.
Yeah, it's something we don't have time to do on a Sunday, but on Thursday night, we'll walk through it. You'll get to see what the first cup is. You'll get to see where he breaks the bread. You'll also get to see the cup of redemption that he picks up. They're all pieces of the Seder meal, of the Passover meal, that he takes those elements that are crucial to their faith and he recasts them or gives them new meaning. And I think for us, just the quick thought on Passover, for the Jewish nation, in the Passover meal, something is going to die and something is going to be set free as a result of that death. So if you just have that thought in mind, Jesus now steps into it. And if they would have had any forethought, and they didn't, they would have recognized that he's putting himself in that place of the Passover lamb, except for he is now the only human that is sinless or spotless. So it's a sacrifice that once it's done, it's over.
For all time.
Like it ends all of those sacrifices. We believe that.
Right.
The Jewish nation would struggle with understanding that, but that's what our faith tells us.
Yep. So you mentioned this, maybe the most iconic, most well-known meal in human history. And maybe not a typical Palm Sunday message, but fits in here. Sure. What has been a new takeaway for you jumping into this story that is familiar, but every year God meets us in a different place. Every day God meets us in a different place. Is there a new takeaway you've got, or a new appreciation, or just a new sightline that you have on this?
Well, I'm still working on that. I'll tell you where I'm focused. Jesus, we know later he goes to the garden and he sweats drops of blood. So we know that anxiety, we know the struggle. We know that he is not my will, but thy will be done. So he's willing to do it. But here, imagine you are now going to give humanity a way to hold this event. How do you hold it together in that moment? How do you wash feet? I when I preach on Sundays, and I'm comfortable doing it now, but I still deal with anxiety. Come on, man. This is the most crucial moment in all of history. And he washes feet. Now, you can say he is, but he's God. Okay, but he later on is in the garden and he's really troubled over this.
Yeah.
But I think for me, for him to say I've eagerly desired, doesn't mean that I'm so thrilled about being here. Eagerly desired is I've looked forward to it. You can't insert what his feeling is. It doesn't say happily or with sadness, or there's just something about him that wanted to be there in this moment. Has to be all of the purpose, all of the prophecy comes together. From the fall of humanity to this point, Jesus is now going to give us the ability to receive forgiveness, to receive grace. And he is with the guys, and it doesn't happen at this table, but he's eagerly desired to get to that table because what he does, and I this is kind of a change of thought, but he's going to give them he tells them to remember. So he's going to give them an anchor that we're going to revisit in our next podcast about Easter.
Mm-hmm.
So he breaks the bread and he offers the cup, and they probably would have said, man, that's weird. My body broken. What's that all about?
Right.
Or my blood shed. Maybe they asked questions. If they did, we don't have it. But it seems like they just choked it down and kept moving. He's doing something different, just as Jesus always did.
Yeah,
Later he'll explain it.
Yeah, he'll fill us in later, or we'll just forget about it.
Yeah. But he does all of this, and then you get into that next line, and you find, or the next part of the scripture where it says, and they started arguing over who's the best. You realize they had no idea.
Well, and that's right after too. He said, "Hey, somebody's going to betray me here."
Yeah. Oh yeah.
And then they just right on. Who is it going to be? And no, the Gospels, they're actually asking, "Is it me? Is it
you?
Is it you?"
Yeah.
And then they move on to, well, but I'm probably the greatest though at this table.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know. I see that a little differently, and I'll tell you why.
Okay.
I think. Oh man, I don't remember exactly what scripture. I think it's John. I think John gives us that story of the conversation that happens, but we feel like when he says this about, oh man, let me find the text where he says it's the person who has the hand on the table. For the Son of Man is going as it has been determined, but woe to the one whom he has betrayed. That's verse 22. 23 says, then they began to ask one another which one of them it could be who would do this. Earlier he said the one who has his hand on the table with me. He doesn't say who they is, but John fleshes that out. And at a table that's set up in the way that it was, it could have been that only a few of them knew he said that. Could have been John, could have been Peter. So clearly Peter knows because he asked John, and John asked Jesus, and then you have this exchange.
Yeah.
So you're almost left to believe that whoever was sitting on the corner of the table had no idea. They may not even have known that this was going to happen, except that in a moment Judas gets up and he runs out.
Yeah.
So maybe they talked about it later, but the narrative we create is everybody's like, "Oh, who's going to do this?"
Probably not that.
Maybe not. It's possible that they could have gotten them from this dinner after the Seder was over, and Jesus goes and does what he typically did, which was to go to the garden to pray. They follow. The guys might have been like, "Where's Judas? Where's this dude at?" Well, he was hightailing it to go get the chief priest to let him know where Jesus was normally going to meet.
Right.
I don't think that's helpful. Well, it's an interesting thought.
It is an interesting dynamic, and again, I just cannot promote Maundy Thursday enough because the table setup is hugely important. What you're saying, I think a lot of us think Last Supper, Leonardo da Vinci painting.
Everybody's sitting in a straight line.
Everybody's just on
forward.
one, yeah, and that was not it at all. And so I didn't really ever think about that before. Seeing and walking through the Maundy Thursday thing. So it totally changes and brings this to life in a whole new way.
Yeah. In fact, and to steal a little bit from the night, John, which should have been sitting right next to Jesus because he leans into his bosom, we know that, or into his chest, and he asks him the question. But Peter is the one that asked the question. We know that later, which means that Peter would have been at the other side of the table, able to have that conversation, which means he would have been in the seat of the servant. So think of all the dynamics of Peter, loudest one, first to lead, first to do all those things, and Jesus picks the seating arrangement. So Jesus would have stuck him at the foot of the table, and John at the head of the table, who's a kid.
Yeah.
So it's so fun going through that process. I
maybe feeds into John saying, "Well, I'm obviously the one he loves.
I'm faster than that slow dude," right? Like the Easter story. So
yeah,
I love Scripture, man.
It's amazing.
Just trying to position the people, think about the heart of Jesus. What does this say for us on a Sunday? Sermon's not written.
It's being written right now.
That's right, it's being written right now. We in our lives sometimes, I don't know if you've ever asked this question, God, are you there? Like, do you even have any clue what's going on in my life?
Yeah.
And then you look at the level of detail in this story. Yeah, he's there. It doesn't mean that he's doing all of those things, but we know he's present, and there's a God that's leading and guiding, and things are falling into place the way that they need to. And sometimes we always need to be searching ourselves and asking ourselves, are we the disciples that are sitting at the table and we have no clue? Is there a lesson he's trying to teach us? Because for him to set the stage as the king who's going to give his life, he really was setting us up to understand that, well, they were all going to do the same thing.
Yeah.
They weren't thinking that at that table that night. I don't even know if they would have signed up for that, but they all willingly did. So for us, when life chokes out faith, or when we get to a place to where we go, oh, God, what's going on? Maybe we stop and we process and we look around and we recognize maybe we need to apply what we know about God to all of the things that were going on in life. Instead of asking God, are you present? Realize that God has sometimes put us in these moments and given us the ability to navigate through, even though they're impossible situations. Thinking about the cycle of life, and we're born and we die, and things we've struggled with physically might bring us to our end, but God has something to say about that.
Yeah.
Or people that we know that have gone through tragic situations with children. What does God have to say about that?
Mm-hmm.
Life's not fair. Sin is horrible. And Jesus had something to say about it. And he walked this road and was willing to go to the cross for us. But in this point, not yet. The disciples still don't know. So we kind of have to check our mind on this side and just go, maybe we're sitting at the table and we don't see clearly, and just give it some time, and maybe we'll understand as we go through. So I would say at the most significant table of all time, you can see me trying to create a thought. Maybe we recognize that we're at the table. Hopefully we're at the table. Yeah. And there's something for us to learn. That's
absolutely
not a wonderful message, but I think it's true.
And I love being able to kind of feel like you're walking through it with them in real time as we lead up to Holy Week and to Easter Sunday and Saturday.
Yeah.
It's, going to be an amazing time together, I think.
I do appreciate you doing this, because it having those kind of conversations, that all of this material for a Sunday morning falls on the cutting room floor. You don't have time to cover it. But it's all there. I can't hardly contain myself about the level of connection and beauty that God has in this set of scripture and what Jesus is walking through. And we've turned it into a 5-minute, 10-minute portion of a Sunday morning service. Okay, Jesus understands that. But anyways.
But maybe there's something more.
Maybe there definitely is something more. I just pray that we'd open up our eyes and see it and connect to it and continue to be a part of the story as it unfolds. It's awesome.
Awesome.
Thanks, bro.
Yep.